They meet you guys. They see our ministries. Yeah. They normally live in San Francisco with Father Anselm. And he loves because they're so noisy. Father Anselm loves noise. So Father Anselm, our last talk was on death. And right about now you have probably the same amount of people. So we like miracles more than death. So good. All right. Very nice. Good. We need miracles. Yeah. And then there's an eraser right here. Let me get you a bottle of water. Okay. Right back.
Can I use that?
You can use whatever you want. Yes. Yes. And now get a bottle of water. Let the miracles begin. Yeah. Published works we've adhered to the second coming. He's a really smart guy, but like I said, he's able to bring really, really difficult concepts down to we mere mortals. So he was here before, I think right before COVID, and he gave a talk on how art, architecture, music kind of brought him back to the faith. He had a sabbatical this past year working on a book on beauty, on art. So when he finishes that book, we'll have it back again.
Oh, yeah.
He said as of right now, he got to the last chapter. It's 1,000 pages right now. So when the book is done, none of us will probably ever read it. So with that,
well then, let's start with the prayers. In the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Almighty and gracious Lord, worker of all miracles, we ask you to work a miracle in our hearts and minds, that we come to a deeper understanding of who you are and how we can come to know you. And we ask you to hear us as we pray. Our Father,
who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Mary, seat of wisdom,
pray for us.
Maybe I should say, I'm a little handicapped. My ears are totally plugged up, so it's really weird to talk right now. But I hope you can all hear me, even if I cannot hear you. But it's a bit strange. But anyway, so we're talking about miracles. And as Father Jerome mentioned, I'm teaching philosophy. And it's maybe a strange topic for a philosopher to talk about. And yet I think there is something important about that. Because many will say, well, I'm a Catholic, I believe, I have no problems with miracles, I believe already in God and everything. But that's not exactly the point. Miracles are there to prove something, and to prove something to people who don't believe yet. So Jesus says, if you don't believe me, at least believe the works I'm doing. Right? And so in the traditional understanding, a miracle is something that authenticates a belief that is really from God. And we'll see some of that. But that means that you must be able to see that even when you don't believe yet. That is, if you're a good pagan philosopher, you should be able to use your reason and figure out, here is a miracle, here's something unusual that has happened, and it must be God who has done that. And so the question is, can we do that? Is that reasonable? Is that rational? And fortunately, the philosophy of religion has made a big comeback in the second half of the 20th century. It's much better than it used to be than, say, the 30s, 40s, or 50s, which was very secular, more secular actually than today, and would not allow any kind of talk of religion in the philosophical academy. There are two particular philosophers who have brought that change about. That is Richard Swinburne and Alvin Plantinga. We don't know them, that doesn't matter. But in the meanwhile, it has grown, and a lot of periodicals and academic publications in the realm of philosophy talking about matters of religion. Questions of theodicy. Why is there evil in the world if God is good? The existence of God, the afterlife, religious experience, atonement, and yes, miracles too. So there are philosophical books written by academic philosophers written on such topics. And so there's a lot of help there if you want, because some of these are also believers and try to defend that belief. There are two questions to be asked stepwise if you want. The first one is it possible that there could be miracles? Philosophically speaking, is it possible? And that as opposed to the question, do they actually happen? Right? These are different questions. So if you don't think miracles could possibly exist, then you're already done, right? Then it couldn't be actual miracles either, right? You could, of course, begin and say, well, there's an actual miracle, and if something is actual, it must be possible, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be there. But if you want to take it stepwise, you can first of all ask the question, just as a matter of principle, could there be miracles? And the way I titled the talk, is it rational to believe miracles, indicates already that there's a certain skepticism about this. The secular world will have skeptical questions about that possibility. Isn't the belief in miracles just something for the simple-minded and superstitious, basically? A thing for bygone ages, outdated, fairy tales. And you find that attitude even among theologians, surprisingly, including scripture scholars, who actually look at the texts that recount miracles, like those of Jesus. There was a famous German Protestant scripture scholar, Rudolf Bultmann, and here's what he says. It is impossible to use electric light and the wireless and to avail ourselves of modern medical and surgical discoveries and at the same time to believe in the New Testament world of spirits and miracles. Again, here's this outlook of the modern world, technology, we have all of these kind of things. How in such an age can we still believe in miracles? What is the argument here? Well, there isn't any. Right? This is just a blank claim, and it may be a kind of an attitude, but there's actually no argument, and there's actually no reason that you could give for such a claim. In fact, people in the time of Jesus knew just as well as we did that a virgin birth is impossible according to science. Right? You don't have to have modern science for that. And in fact, an earlier philosopher, namely Hegel, was quite aware that if you don't have a solid understanding of laws of nature, you also will not have a solid understanding of miracles. Right? Because that's the contrast. If there's no regularity in nature that you can understand and find and discover and describe as laws of nature, you will not find the exception to that, right? Which is the miracle. If everything is miraculous and everything is fantastic, then nothing is miraculous, basically. So it's not that modern understanding of science would be against miracles. In fact, we should be more attuned to miracles now that we have this solid understanding of it. Now there's another objection that may say that now that we have this wonderful scientific understanding of the world, we don't believe, or we don't have to believe in miracles anymore. You know, there used to be a god of thunder, for example. So people didn't understand how thunder comes about, and so they invented a god of thunder that explains that. And these miracles are not just more of the same, basically. And yet now we have all the science that explains it much better, and so we don't need it anymore. That's sort of the argument. But already Thomas Aquinas knew quite well how to distinguish particular cases. He says there can be things that look wondrous to us just because we haven't explained them yet. But miracles are a different case. Why? Because the things that natural science explains by coming up with laws of nature are things that happen regularly. That is why these are laws of nature. It is thundering not just once, but regularly under certain specified conditions, and we can describe those conditions. What science indeed does explain much better now are such regularities. But miracles are the opposite of regularities. They are the exception to the rule. And therefore, this is a very different case. Again, knowing science and explaining things better puts us actually in a better position to recognize miracles, not the other way around. So this is a kind of first-line response to some of the skepticism that's out there, just to get some ideas clear. But it's not just a question of what does the world think about miracles, it's also what do we think about miracles. How does that look even to the eyes of a modern believer, or any believer really? Now, and if we look at the to Catholic theology for an answer, the answer is less clear than one may expect. On the one hand, Christianity is the religion that relies most on miracles. Miracles is not just a sidebar of our faith, it's at the very heart of it. The central miracle of our faith is what?
Resurrection.
Resurrection. We just had Easter. And surprisingly good evidence and ways to explain that it's very rational to believe that the resurrection has happened. That's not what I'm going to do tonight, but it could be another talk. So what this to say, if we cannot believe that, if it is not rational to believe that, then we are done. That means also Christianity is the most vulnerable to objections to miracles. So we have a really great interest in defending that it is rational to believe in miracles. It's absolutely central. You cannot take that out from Christianity and still keep Christianity. And so it is central. And if you think of Jesus' claim, so Jesus was not just a nice teacher. C.S. Lewis explained that well. I mean, he doesn't just give you moral wisdom or something like that, or like was by being a good man. He claimed to be God, right? And no just wise man claims that. You must be crazy to claim something like that, or a deceiver, or else you are God. And how do we know that he was God? Because he rose from the dead. Right? It's a central claim here that is at stake. So, Catholic theology defends that, and First Vatican Council is very specific in stating that we must believe in miracles and prophecy. It's part of our faith. So it's something that helps us to believe and proves the faith to us, but it is also part of what we believe, part of the very content of what we believe. And so we are more vulnerable to skepticism in that regard than other religions. On the other hand, the Church herself is somewhat skeptical. So if you go around and say, I just had an aversion of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the bishop just coming and saying, great, wonderful, give a talk in the parish about it. Says, oh, no, let's have a closer look at this. And usually the Church takes a long time looking at these kind of things and discerning what is really going on. And there could be all sorts of explanations there. And I mean, Medjugorje, for example, has been going for a long time. The Church still has no final judgment on that. It's very careful about that. And what does the Church use to discern these kind of things? Science. Science is our friend for many reasons, but even for an appropriate kind of skepticism in that regard. So in Lourdes, for example, you have many healings that are reported, but the Church is very careful to evaluate them. So there are some numbers from, I think, 2009 or so. There were about 30,000 healings that have occurred in Lourdes. 6,000 are documented. 2,000 are considered medically inexplicable, but only 67 were declared to be miracles by the Church. So it whittles it down quite a bit. And how do they do that? Well, they have an office and a committee of scientists and medical professionals who look at the evidence. And there's to be a lot of documentation before and after and for a long period of time, and so forth and so on. Could be its own turn to look at that in more detail. But these people are not paid, have no personal interest in making gain from that. Many of them are atheists. And yet, at the end of the procedure, they are willing to say, this is something we cannot explain. They may not become Catholic. That's not exactly the immediate next step, but even an atheist will be able to say, this is something we cannot physically, naturally explain. And that is what science does in that context. And so the church is very careful with these things, and it can concern healings, it can concern apparitions. It also concerns canonization processes. As you know, you need to have 2 miracles to become a saint after your death. If you can make that happen, you know, canonization happen. But so just to say, so it's not any kind of naive superstition here. In fact, if we didn't do that, if we didn't employ science and philosophy to evaluate things, then we would be open to the charge of superstition. But the church has never done such a thing. St. Augustine, early in his life, was actually rather skeptical too. He said, well, fine, maybe, you know, the apostles worked miracles, that was important to establish the faith. Jesus, of course, did. But after that, miracles ceased to happen. We call that cessationism, or they ceased to happen. And there are many, especially Protestants, are cessationists. John Henry Newman initially was a cessationist too. But John Henry Newman changed his mind, and so did St. Augustine. When did St. Augustine change his mind? When he became the Bishop of Hippo and had to look into so many miracle claims. So if you look at The City of God, his famous book, in the later chapters he's going on and on, one miracle after another that he tells the story about. He just couldn't help looking at the evidence and seeing that there is something that is happening here. But it takes to test that, and he did. Now, when we come to think of the possibility of miracles, some will say, of course it is possible that miracles happen. And that does not necessarily have to be a breaking of the laws of nature or an exception to the rule or anything like that. So to give you one example, let's say there's a child playing on the train tracks, and his mother watches from afar and sees the train is coming at high speed, coming closer and closer and closer. And then right at that point, the train comes to a screeching halt, there's maybe half a meter in front of that child. Meanwhile, the mother has prayed to God to spare her child. So upon looking at what happened, apparently the train driver has to keep a lever pushed for the train to keep going. He fell asleep and let the lever go, and the train stopped right there. Okay. Was that a miracle? You can call it a miracle, and it's a miracle of providence. And God can foresee that certain things will happen in the natural course of events without him having to intervene to make that actually happen. And the mother has prayed for that, right? And so if an atheist sees that, will the atheist be convinced that a miracle has happened and that a God has heard the prayers of the mother? No. The atheist would be perfectly fine. So if you want to believe that, that's fine. We've always thought that religion is just wishful thinking. It wouldn't prove anything in that regard. But is the mother right to thank God afterwards to save her child? Yes. Right? So you can believe that this is a kind of a miracle, but it's a miracle of providence. It works with the natural ways in which the universe works, and God can arrange things accordingly. I mean, he foreknows that from all eternity the mother will pray, and so forth and so on. But it's not the kind of miracle of the greatest magnitude, one that should convince even an atheist that something inexplicable has happened. And that's the kind of miracle I'm asking about. The miracles that Jesus worked couldn't really be of that sort. Why? Well, in the case of the child on the train tracks, the mother prays, but the mother is a bystander, right? She watches what happens. She's not making it happen. But Jesus puts the hands on somebody, or makes somebody stand up and take his mat and walk, and works a miracle right there and then. How would Jesus know that just at that moment some strange coincidence of laws of nature coincide at that point to make somebody get up or something, if that's even possible, right? To have that kind of knowledge is actually more miraculous than this actually happening, right? That itself would prove that he's God. But I think that is actually not the most likely explanation. I mean, if he really is God, he can make it happen anyway. He can put the laws of nature out of gear and does something beyond what nature can do. And that's the kind of miracle we are talking about here. And again, still talking about the possibility of miracles, there are some who say that you cannot, God cannot work miracles because he would be violating not just the laws of nature, but himself. So Protestant theologian Paul Tillich thought that, for example. And Spinoza would say the same thing. But they are basically pantheists. And I think that God is really the whole thing. So if you have, let's say this big blob is the world, right? But this is also God for them. They're pantheists. That means God is everything. Right? And now if such a God would change the world miraculously, he would have to change himself. It's a strange idea to think, right? And if the way the world works is as necessary as God is in his being, and the laws of nature are as necessary as God is, then for God to break that would mean it's impossible, or he would break himself, basically, right? So Paul Tillich thinks God would become schizophrenic and demonic and things like that. Well, if you're a pantheist, that may be right, but Christians are not pantheists, right? So we believe, say that's God. Sorry for this, it's very simple kind of. And so here you have the world, right?
Philosopher, not an artist.
It's as simple as it needs to be, right? And so then God can intervene and change something in the world here, right? It doesn't change himself, it changes something here. Right? And he also has made the whole thing with the laws of nature in it. And there could be totally different worlds with different laws of nature. Right? What you see at that moment is, if there are miracles of the sort that we are talking about, that actually says something not just about the world, but about God, who God is. This cannot be God if there are miracles. But to say that God couldn't possibly work miracles for the reasons just explained, that's just your presupposition of a particular kind of metaphysics, which we don't believe in the first place, and we don't have to believe. But if you find something like the resurrection, and we think there is good evidence for that, or the miracles in Lourdes, that indicates there must be something beyond nature which not only can manipulate nature, but can change something about the laws of nature. And what kind of being must this be? That must be the kind of being that actually created the laws of nature. God made these laws. He is the author of the laws. He is the lawgiver. And if he's the lawgiver, he can also suspend the laws. So a miracle, one of the reasons why God may work miracles is to show who he is. That he transcends the universe, that he's the author of the laws of nature, he's not subject to it. He is not any kind of impersonal force of the universe or something like that, like Star Wars, and the force be with you. God is not a force, God is a person. And so we don't say the force be with you at Mass. It's not an anonymous kind of thing or mechanism or entity that you can manipulate or meditate yourself into or something like that. He is a person you can talk to and you actually may work a miracle for you. And that is in a very specific part of our faith. It's called intercessory prayer. Right? What good is it for you to pray to God to heal your sick aunt in the hospital from a deadly illness that only God could heal, if God cannot do that? And yet we do pray to God that way. Our very faith implies that that's the kind of God we are talking about. And there's nothing impossible about that once you see that kind of picture. So it shows that God is the maker of all things, but also that the way the world is, including the scientific laws, could have been otherwise. God could have created another world. It makes us look even differently at science. It doesn't make science impossible at all. I'll come back to that point. It's actually the opposite. But it gives us the idea that we should actually be wondering at why God made these things the way he did. Because we now have come to see that he's the author of all these things. Good. So let's say that covers the question of possibility of miracles. We can come back to that with questions later if you want. Now then the next question may be, let's say all of that is indeed possible. But does God work miracles? And if he does, could we possibly know it? Could there ever be enough evidence for us to recognize a miracle? And that's a question that famously David Hume raised. I've heard that name before. Hume. And ever since, lots of ink has been spilled on that question. Yes, many people have written about the question of miracles. So now we have first of all to understand what David Hume's objection is, and go a little bit through that, and just to make his case strong enough, and then I'll explain to you how to respond to that objection. David Hume's argument is not that there are laws of nature that couldn't be possibly violated. In fact, he himself has a very weak notion of these laws and what we can know about these things. He's an empiricist, he's actually a bit skeptical about all of these things. And nevertheless, he says, we weigh the evidence, and what we have are these laws of nature that regularly occur all the time. Even you just sitting there, implicitly gives you evidence to believe in the law of gravity. You don't expect to reverse suddenly and float to the ceiling. So we live with that, and the laws of nature are in evidence all the time. There's lots of evidence for that. But a miracle is opposed to the laws of nature. And it happens perhaps only once. There's a little bit of evidence about that perhaps. So you have all this evidence for the laws of nature, just a little bit for the miracles. And the miracles contradict that, and so therefore you weigh these kind of things, and the laws of nature will always trump the evidence for miracles. We never have enough evidence and good reason to believe that a miracle has occurred. And so even if a miracle would have occurred, we couldn't know it. Just keep that part short. If you add to that a further complication, that miracles that we believe in, such as the resurrection, happened in the past, 2,000 years ago. We have to rely on all sorts of documents and other kind of evidence. How likely is it that we have good evidence here? Are these documents trustworthy? Are the people who have handed it down to us trustworthy? And so it seems that the evidence for miracles is dwindling down, and the regular evidence for the laws of nature always trumps whatever we can say about the miracles. There was another atheist, Anthony Flew.
Write some right really big, please.
Okay. F-L-E-W. He's sort of a bit of the older generation of debating atheists. You know the new atheists, Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and all these people, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, God rest his soul. And but they were pretty brutal and vile in the way they approach things. Or people don't talk about them anymore. It's interesting. Sometimes you wish we had a good atheist to debate with. Now people are just apathetic. But anyway, Anthony Flew was a bit before that. He was a bit more of a gentleman and so forth. And he actually seems to have changed his mind towards the end of his life and found some of these things. But he picks up this argument from David Hume as well. And he says, especially for these historical cases, scientific evidences must be more because it happens all the time and here and now, and so we can test it now, right? But if we have a miracle that happened in the past, that's just a unique event, and we cannot test it anymore. It's in the past, right? You cannot put it in the laboratory now, and so forth and so on. And so it's not repeatable as you would have for scientific evidence. Moreover, for us to have that kind of evidence relies on using the laws of nature to trace it back to the past. If that means even to know about that miracle means we have to rely on the laws of nature, therefore give more evidence for the laws of nature, and it will always trump the evidence for the miracle. So that is, in a nutshell, the argument. And first of all, we don't have to be afraid of that argument. It's not a good one. And I'll show you why. So what should we say to that? There are some quibbles one can have. I'm going to skip that with just the formulation of David Hume. But first of all, it is true that miracles are more rare than the normal working of nature. That's just by definition what a miracle is. But the question is, does that mean we have to dismiss individual cases, even if they contradict the evidence for miracles, or that means even if we have all this evidence for natural laws? Well, every case counts, and there can be cases that actually are counter-evidence to laws of nature that we assume to have found in the past. People have changed their minds about laws of nature after all. Right? There are so-called recalcitrant cases that just don't fit. You can have a law of nature and you test it in the laboratory, and the tests may not come out as you wish. Now, what happened? Well, if you're David Hume, you would say, well, then we have to dismiss that. The experiment must have gone wrong, right? It's a foregone conclusion that what I'm testing must be true, and therefore I don't even wait for the results anymore. That's not a scientific procedure. Science doesn't work that way. You can take these things and test them, and there can be cases that turn out otherwise than you would think. If you're David Hume, you would have to dismiss each case. And oddly, Hume actually says so. So he says it is totally rational for a prince in India in his own day, who has never witnessed temperatures below freezing, to dismiss a tale that somebody tells him about the phenomenon of frost in the northern hemisphere, or ice, right? There can be no such thing possible, right? I've never seen such a thing. My evidence for laws of nature is the opposite. And Hume says it would be perfectly rational for him to dismiss that. Or we should have dismissed the first account of black swans in Australia, for example. So we could never change our mind, or we would have to dismiss that as a superstition or a form of deception or something like that. Now some may say, well, if you have just enough black swans or something, the evidence will add up sufficiently to change that. But how could it add up if you dismiss each individual piece of evidence? Right? You just would add up zeros, basically. If you dismiss each, you dismiss all. Right? So you must take even the first case seriously, even to arrive there. Now, let's say, though, for the sake of argument, we do that. So the evidence may add up, and eventually we may change our mind. The question is, do we even have to wait for the evidence to add up? Or could one case be sufficient? Well, if we have the scenario of an experiment and you have contrary evidence, that might rattle you enough to think about how we can explain that better. And maybe you can come up with a law that explains what looks like an exception and all the other evidence as well. And then it's perfectly rational to change your mind here and now, even without having accumulated so much evidence. Scientific theories don't have to be confirmed by sufficient data necessarily. Karl Popper was the one who said what makes a law or scientific theory scientific is that it can be falsified. You have to give cases in which you would say, this is contrary evidence, now I have to relinquish my theory. If you can give that kind of account, then the theory is scientific. Well, you may have actually evidence that is against your theory, and then you have to take that seriously. It would have been falsified. Now, what is important about that is, as I just said, if you come up with a new theory in the face of such a recalcitrant case, that theory doesn't just explain your recalcitrant case, it explains also the previous data that you had before, based on which you assumed a particular law of nature. That is, what you propose now, you don't have to weigh against the past evidence that you have. It includes that evidence. That evidence actually becomes evidence for your new theory. And something similar is true, I want to claim, for miracles. Now, miracles are a little bit different because miracles don't make you change your laws of nature. Miracles are still against laws of nature, or at least an exception to the rule, let's say. And nevertheless, we can easily imagine that in the light of these miracles, we have a paradigm shift, as you would say, or have a different outlook on reality that explains the miracle and the laws of nature at the same time. So let's take, to get to the heart of the matter, let's take the apostles after the resurrection. Right? So they saw the evidence, they saw the empty tomb, and they saw the witnesses and heard the witnesses talking about it, and had the appearances of Jesus and all these kind of things. It took them some time to let that sink in and change their mind. We know all these stories, we read them right now at Mass. And it didn't happen right away. So you can say there's a sort of an accumulation happening, right? The evidence accumulates and slowly changes their minds in some way. And then they may have been sufficiently startled to see all this new kind of a light and come to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. If you add Pentecost, that will even do more. Now, everything that they have believed before has not stopped being there, nor does it contradict what they believe now. What they have believed, as good practicing Jews, looks now different from the perspective that they have now after the resurrection, but it doesn't contradict it, just the opposite, it confirms it. We understand the prophecies now, let's say the suffering servant in Isaiah and so forth. Now this is for, the matters of faith, but what about laws of nature? So again, people knew about laws of nature, and they knew that something was natural and other things were not. Would that make them disbelieve the laws of nature they have believed in before? No, if that, what opens up here is this picture, that this kind of God is the one who also makes the laws of nature. They just have more evidence for someone who makes laws of nature. Right? The same God who works miracles is also the God that makes laws of nature. And therefore you can have, if you want a scientific paradigm shift or something, that gives you that kind of perspective. And what David Hume claims to be evidence against miracles, namely the evidence for laws of nature, is speaking for miracles, because they are evidence for the same kind of God who works miracles. Now, one could go on here and make a totally additional case here and showing why laws of nature actually need an explanation, and that explanation is God. You can make actually additional arguments to support that. C.S. Lewis says, the miracle may have been improbable compared to the laws of nature, but at some point, everything is improbable. Right? Before God creates the world, the very existence of the world is improbable. That God would make a world that has laws of nature is improbable. That God makes these laws of nature is even more improbable. And that miracles are improbable does not make a great difference in that scenario. So the kind of probability in weighing evidence, I think, is very misapplied here in the way that David Hume or Anthony Flew cast that question. So the evidence for laws of nature are not evidence against miracles. They're just more evidence for the same God who also works miracles, and vice versa. Now, what about the historical arguments of Anthony Flew? How can we know that? I mean, so there were the apostles and their eyewitnesses, but we were not, so we have to believe what they tell us. How can we know something 2,000 years after the fact, or sometimes less? And so that's a question of how to look at history and how to evaluate history. There's one, yet another Protestant theologian, Ernst Troeltsch, big letters, who formulated the principle of analogy. And that states that the past cannot be dissimilar to our present experience. So if we don't, to cut it short, I mean, if we don't experience miracles here and now, then they cannot have happened in the past. Well, the first thing to say about that is that I don't experience miracles here and now shouldn't surprise me, because that's not something I should expect in the first place, even here and now. Right? But it could also be, and as someone who has written 2 volumes on that, that this is also particularly Western kind of prejudice, because in other parts of the world, people witness miracles all the time. So, that's part of this general culture, and so it's not so anomalous. There's not a disanalogy, in other words, between the present and the past in that account. But it's also, again, a misapplied principle. For one, history is full of unique events. That's just what makes it history. Right? I mean, natural cycles are always the same, but history is always different. There are unique individuals that take unique actions and so forth. If you would apply that principle strictly, you wouldn't have history. History will be dissimilar from the present period. The time of Shakespeare is different from our time, and so forth. But there is a value in that principle if you apply it properly. And that is, you should evaluate evidence from the past in the same way in which you evaluate evidence from the present. So if we know from present circumstances that certain people will hallucinate if you give them drugs, you will probably not be so likely to believe their testimony, right? If you know that they are on drugs. The same would be true if you knew that the apostles were on drugs, then you had hallucinations. Of course, there are checks and balances, then you would still produce the body and the tomb wouldn't be empty. But still, I mean, the analogy here is a matter of method more than of content. The content can be dissimilar. Even if you don't have a miracle now, could still be in the past, the methods would be the same. And the same methods that lead you to disbelieve certain evidence should also make you believe certain evidence, in other words. So if testimony is good today, it is also good in the past. Now, Anthony Flew also says that you need to presuppose the laws of nature to have access to evidence in the past. And that is correct, and that is a good thing. Because how do we do that? How do we evaluate evidence from the past? By using science. And yes, science is our friend and it vindicates our faith all the time. Don't be afraid of science. And there could be tons of examples for that. But in this case, it is science that allows you to look at present evidence and trace it back to something that cannot be explained by laws of nature. And I give you an example for something that we don't consider typically as a miracle. That's the Big Bang. So if the Big Bang is what, at least traditionally people claim, it's the beginning of space and time and of matter, and it must have a spiritual cause, therefore. And it is not explained by the laws of nature, because before space and time there are no laws of nature to explain anything. The Big Bang begins not only space and time, but the laws of nature, and therefore cannot be explained by the laws of nature. And how do we know about that? Well, by extrapolating back from what we see by looking through telescopes and other instruments in the sky, and looking back what that may point back to, light years back, and so forth and so on. And we trace that back, and we come to this point of the Big Bang, using laws of nature to come to a point that cannot be explained by laws of nature. And something analogous we would do when we prove the existence of a miracle in the past. And that is using types of sciences that David Hume didn't know yet about. For example, scientific archaeology, or dendrochronology. You know what that is? That's how you can date the age of a tree. So if you have a sculpture, something that's made of a piece of wood, you can look at that and date that piece of wood. It gives you at least a time frame. You can indeed accumulate evidence of that sort. There's also forensic criminology that has developed all sorts of things that is looking at crime scenes, cigarette ashes, bomb craters, fingerprints, pollen, all sorts of things, carbon dating, and so many other kind of things. You know the Shroud of Turin? Mm-hmm. Just to give you one example, the Shroud of Turin is probably the most studied artifact of the world, really. Scientifically studied in many ways all the time. And one of the things that somebody tested, and I think it was around the 1970s, was a police officer from Switzerland who was working with these kind of methods. And he did this pollen test on the Shroud of Turin. And of course, there are all these kind of claims that it was sort of somebody was cheating and making that up in the Middle Ages or something. Well, he found, so that the test is, you can test the clothing of a criminal, look at what pollen are in his clothing, and then you can sort of tell where he was. So it works. What he found is that the most pollen on the shroud were from the Holy Land, from plants that bloom at that time of the Passion in the vicinity of Jerusalem. Now that's pretty good evidence for the shroud having existed at that point in time, in that place, and not what other people say that it was later or kind of a fraud of some sorts. In the Middle Ages, nobody would have had the idea to fake that because they didn't know of the existence of pollen and things like that. So this is just one example of how you use scientific methods and scientific laws of nature, indeed, to trace something back to a particular kind of origin. Now that doesn't explain it the Shroud of Turin, but it's just there's many pieces of evidences that you can accumulate, and then you have to explain what hypothesis explains all these data points and what hypothesis explains it best. And you can come to some pretty good conclusions that way. The other thing about that is, it is present evidence. The shroud exists now. The tilma of Juan Diego, with Our Lady of Guadalupe on it, exists now. You can test it now. You can indeed put it into the laboratory and repeatedly perform tests on it, and people do that. And so you can accumulate evidence over time just as you would for any other kind of scientific field. It's not different at all. And you can come to a point at which, and it's not even a matter of accumulation, you can come to a point where you use your testing devices. Let's say here's a microscope or something like that. Here's you looking through it. And here is a kind of a causal process that obeys the laws of nature. Say that's time axis or something. And so here is A causing B, causing C, causing D, causing E, and so forth and so on. And maybe here is something that disrupts that. Now you can see such a disruption through your testing device, right? So it's where you do pollen testing, radiocarbon testing, dendrochronology, whatever it is. Now, if you can say, of course, there's something not right here, but you can also say maybe there's something wrong with my testing device. Right? And that is true. And but perhaps, you know, you can say, well, I test this, and maybe you come to a kind of a stalemate here, or a draw between the two, and so forth, and that's the most you can do. No, if you have a conflict of any sort, you have a miracle, because either the miracle has happened here, or it has happened in the testing device. That's possible too. The most fundamental testing device is this, your eye. Miracles also can happen in your eye. And so if you have apparitions, you may have seen that, you know, there's somebody in ecstasy looking at something that nobody else sees. You can test the eye, and people actually do that. They shine lights into the eye, and they test what's going on in the eye. The eye is just another testing device. You're an eyewitness, and eyewitnesses can be tested too. But it doesn't matter whether the miracle happens here or in the eye, it is a miracle. And this is, in either case, if the miracle happens here, there's also something about the laws of nature that operate in your eye that has been put out of gear. Right? That also is a miracle, just to understand that. Now, and that is indeed also what people do. So you can test eyewitnesses, not just physiological, but also, say, in court procedures. We do that all the time. There are laws people learn about how to evaluate testimony in the court. And witnesses in the court can be very broken devices indeed. Not miraculously broken, but for all sorts of reasons. And it's the kind of things maybe David Hume talks about, ignorant and barbarous people, you know, who believe in these kind of things. Well, there are ignorant, barbarous people, and ignorant, barbarous witnesses, and people that are lying and so forth. But it doesn't matter whether they're ignorant, barbarous, or immoral. You can still evaluate their testimony. For example, we all know that it is very difficult to keep your story straight if you tell a lie. You have to keep track on all the things you have said in the past to be consistent about your lie. If you don't lie, you don't have to worry about that, because reality is consistent. There's no question about that. You don't have to, it will agree with that, what you say. But if you're lying, you have to keep your story straight. It takes a lot of mental energy to do that, and eventually it will go wrong. And I think that's one of the reasons why the church takes a lot of time to evaluate testimony from people. And now, if you add to that, I mean, you would have an almost miraculous power of mind, you know, to keep your story straight for a long time. If you now add to that, you may have multiple independent witnesses that are all lying and trying to keep the story straight. Let's take the 12 apostles going out into all the world and telling the same story in all places of the world and keep that story straight for all the time. Not even to mention that they're willing to die for it. You know. That's almost miraculous too, if it were not true. So independent, multiple witnesses if there's a certain point at which we can say, if that is made up, that is more miraculous than what they're claiming. And so you can evaluate these kind of things, and there are laws about that, and these are scientific laws. Whether it's about physical laws and testing devices, or even laws of eyewitnesses. And if you don't believe those kind of procedures, you shouldn't believe in laws of nature either, because that's exactly the way in which we get our evidence for laws of nature. We test things by devices, or by looking at things, eyewitnesses, right? That's always our last recourse. And so these are eminently rational kind of ways in which to evaluate evidence. And then finally, you can also, and oh, by the way, I'm sorry, you have to trust witnesses, yes. But science has to do that too. In the scientific community, everybody works on a little specialty and trusts what somebody else is doing and using that as a stepping stone for the next thing. There's trust going on everywhere and all the time in the world. That's not irrational to do that. Science does the same thing. And again, can, if need be, also verify. Trust but verify. But nevertheless, there's a certain amount of trust that's also not irrational at all. And so and sometimes these things can be combined too. So take the miracle of the sun in Fatima, right? You have, first of all, prophecy. Now prophecy is an interesting case for a miracle too. That's eminently testable. You just deposit a prophecy, put it in writing, put it in a safe, put a seal on it and so forth, and say, this is what's going to happen in 50 years exactly. So something's happening in 50 years, you open the safe, and lo and behold, that says that. And could you have known that? Well, if it's about human people doing something, how can you predict free human acts and so forth? There's only one person who can, in the long run, predict such things, and that is God. That knowledge must come from God. So you can test that. But, of course, if you have a prophet, say Elijah or something, who makes a prophecy, at that time that hasn't yet happened. So the evidence is not yet in. And that is one of the reasons why prophets typically work miracles, to authenticate that what they are saying is from God. So it's an additional miracle. But that having been said, after a prophecy has been fulfilled, you can look back at that and say, wow, that must have come from God. And indeed, people have made that case and looked at all the Old Testament prophecies that have been fulfilled in the New Testament. You can all make the arguments as tight as you want. There's a lot of evidence and a lot of fulfilled prophecy independently from each other. If you take that seriously, there's even a mathematician who has made that proof mathematically. That is actually astounding. So prophecy is a good case, and in hindsight at least, you can show that. Now, in the case of the miracle of the sun in Fatima, the children predicted that this miracle would happen, and it did. So that's remarkable in itself. Now, what happened then is, the sun spinning out of control and approaching the earth and so forth. Where did that miracle happen? In the universe?
That's hard to say.
If it happened in the universe, we wouldn't be here, right? The solar system would have spun out of course, and we would have been. It didn't happen out here, it happened here. But it's a miracle nonetheless. And it was witnessed by hundreds of thousands of people in also different physical locations. So it's not a mass hallucination or something, or a mass psychology of some sort. It's independent eyewitnesses to something, even if it's something that happens in the eye of the beholder.
Which miracle was that?
That's Fatima. Fatima.
Portugal, Fatima, Portugal.
Oh, okay.
The miracle of the sun.
Yeah, okay.
So the children predicted that, fulfilled prophecy. Many independent witnesses in different geographic locations that rules out, hallucination, deceiving, and all these kind of things, including non-believers. there were a lot of journalists, and from what I understand, they also took photos of it, so there's a miracle happening in the apparatus too, right, the device. And not everything happened in the eye or on the device, but also physically, even if it's not the sun. But before that, there was torrential rain, and everything was a big field of mud and so forth, and it was all dry after that. It's also inexplicable. So it's the combination of these kind of things is inexplicable. I mean, how much more evidence do you want, really? You know, and that's scientific evidence. You can test it, you can independently verify it, and so forth and so on. So, I mean, maybe that's sufficient, and we can keep more with questions, but this whole kind of questions of possibility often is evaluated in terms of probabilities and so forth. Well, what you think is probable depends on your presuppositions, right? And for one, as C.S. Lewis said, you know, once upon a time, everything was improbable, right? If you just zero out far enough, you know, the whole universe is improbable, right? And again, it also depends what you think. David Hume and others will presuppose the laws of nature as evidence, right? How do they know that? That's a different kind of background knowledge that comes from a totally different kind of field, and you just include that in your expectations without justifying it. And I think it is in need of justification, in fact. But if they can do that, if an atheist can do that, why could we not do that? There are plenty of arguments for the existence of God. And I would include in these arguments, in the evidence for the existence of God, the laws of nature themselves, which would be another talk, actually. If you see all of that, and if you have a rational case for the existence of God for so many reasons, then you can take that as your presupposition. And then a miracle suddenly doesn't look very unlikely anymore. The kind of God that we believe in, who is omnipotent, who is benevolent, who knows us, who has created us, who knows that we are in dire straits, morally and otherwise, that we are in need of guidance, that we are in need of the kind of evidence that a miracle would give, would we expect such a thing? Isn't that actually rather probable, not improbable? Just to say, it depends on your presuppositions, and there's no reason, even if you're not a Christian yet, you know, you have evidence for the existence of a God, and you know, perhaps even a benevolent God and so forth, and then you see the resurrection, and you say, well, then this must be the one true religion. So you can see that you can come on that from very different angles, and much of that does depend on your presuppositions. But even from atheist presuppositions, even if you take just natural science, you can find very good evidence for miracles. And it's not against science, it is precisely science that shows us that evidence. More than ever, because we have more than ever such science that shows these things. And there would be lots of other examples for that, but I think I stop here and leave the rest for questions.
It says in Scripture that the devil can appear as an angel of light. I'm curious about whether or not other entities can perform miracles. In particular, I'm thinking about a fellow named John of God, that many people flocked to see him and claimed that there were these miracles that happened, and he was attributing it to God in himself. So the pantheistic view. I'm just wondering, is there anything you can say to that question? Because people will say, well, there's been other miracles, and you know, and they will point to that, which then discredits or diminishes the miracles
We're going
of Christ.
straight to the next talk I would give if I had the time.
Is there a question?
See, but that's, let's say, well, what I've been talking about is, you come to the point, let's say, where the atheist doctor in Lourdes, that bureau that is evaluating these cases, can say, here's something we cannot explain naturally anymore. Right? That's as far as it would get, and that's as far, say, that we have gotten here, right? Then a whole other set of questions arises, but that's usually not the point. I mean, people don't even get to that point anymore. But you're quite right. So then the question is arising, what is the cause for that? So there is an explanatory gap, and people talk about the God of the gaps. Here's actually a legitimate application for that, because there's an explanatory gap. There's something that requires an explanation, but there's no physical explanation around. It must be a spiritual explanation. But what kind of spiritual agent are we talking about, right? So you can make that in terms of bifurcation, right? So you have an infinite spiritual agent, that's God, right? There are finite spiritual agents, okay, finite and infinite, right? And among the finite spiritual agents, some are embodied and some are unembodied. The embodied ones, that's us. And you can even ask, what can human beings do? And some people think there's more that we can do that looks preternatural than others do. They're typically more to be found in India, and some Islamic thinkers thought that too. But leaving that aside, there are finite, purely spiritual beings. They're angels and fallen angels, demons. And I think we have to be very worried about, people immediately jumping on all sorts of preternatural claims, saying, well, look, here's a miracle and God is showing us something. Oh, how do you know that that's not demonic? And the devil can appear as an angel of light, as you say, and even do some very pious things. And you sometimes find then suddenly the whole thing gets derailed and it's terrible. And people who have believed in that, with such fervor and emotional involvement will be totally disaffected and turn away from the faith altogether. Right? And then the devil has achieved his goal. That's just one of the many trajectories that can take. So yes, you're quite right. That needs to be evaluated. And that needs a whole other kind of talk about, and also a set of evaluations. For one, there are different kinds of miracles. Thomas Aquinas in various places distinguishes 3 levels. And there are some miracles that only God can work. For example, raising somebody from the dead. And other things that angels or demons can work. Now, one thing, you have sort of on the ground level, you also have to look at, what kind of story is being told here. These are intelligent agents. There's a narrative that explains the actions of intelligent agents. And so somebody who is doing these kind of things to gain money, right? Bad sign. And then even the church fathers already comment on that, or that just do frivolous.
The pastor's fundraiser.
Or the pastor's fundraiser. Oh, we have a miracle, that's and so a bad sign, or leading people astray based on faith criteria. And good, so if an angel works something, or an apostle works a miracle, right? But you find that in the book of Acts, people fall down and try to worship the apostles. Oh, this is Apollos or something like that. And a pagan god appeared. What do they always do? No. That's not us doing it, it's God doing that. And angels will do the same thing. They always point back to God. The demons won't do that. They want to be worshipped. Right? So that's sort of just the narrative that unfolds. They will tell you something. But there are also things that finite spiritual agents cannot do in principle. So I mentioned the resurrection from the dead, but there are certain healing miracles that, there's some you can explain psychosomatically, and that's natural. And so you have to look at each case, and that's why you have an office in Lord looking into that. But there are some healings. So Thomas Aquinas thinks angels can do demons can do very clever things, right? There could be like a very good doctor having good instruments, but they always have to use natural principles, which for one would mean often it cannot be instantaneous. God and his omnipotence can do something in a split second. It's like creation, which which takes God's omnipotence, which makes something out of nothing. You go from nothing to something. There's no time lag. there's nothing in between, right? And so, likewise, if God works a miracle, it's typically very instantaneous. Not always, but typically, and it's a good sign. And demons cannot do that. They have to avail themselves of natural principles, even the Aquinas thinks they can accelerate it, or just like somebody who is working trickery or prestidigitation, or how you call that. I mean, where something very quickly with your fingers, magicians, stage magicians, and things like that. So they can do all of those things and can do them better, probably. But there are things that you cannot explain that way. So raising from the dead, instantaneous healings, but even healings that bypass natural processes. So you have people who were blind, they didn't have even pupils in their eyes, right? They suddenly can see, but they still don't have pupils. Right? That's not naturally explicable, right? So a being that has to use natural principles would have to restore the pupils at least for that to happen. Right? So those kind of things. So you can make these distinctions. That can get a bit more tricky, but that's certainly possible. And so the church has been doing that for a while. There was a Pope Benedict XIV in the 18th century has a whole book on miracles doing that, because before that he was in charge of canonizations. And you had to evaluate all these cases that were brought to him and the miracles that, and so he has a lot of ways of evaluating that. I myself have tried to do that. Even if you don't have a major miracles that you know must be from God, you can look at these minor miracle claims and see how they fit in. As I said, with an angel will be in sync with God, basically, right? But there are many other kind of ways. It's a very complex story to tell, but it's very interesting if you get into that. You have to look at, as I said earlier, the implied narrative of what is going on there, and whether it can possibly be consistent and so on. I cannot explain that right now. That's a long, long thing to go into. It would be very interesting. But that's, as I said, that's a question that arises once this has been done. And most people don't even get there yet. Yes, I think you were next.
Father Raymond, part of your job is to affect the comfortable.
Sorry, I just had a hard time hearing it.
Part of your job is to afflict the comfortable. I'm too comfortable, you understand?
Yeah.
Because I didn't speak up when we started. In my mind, the most important thing for Roman Catholics to believe is not in the resurrection, but that there is a God.
Yes, but Muslims believe that too.
Pardon?
Muslims believe that too in Judaism.
That doesn't matter.
No, you're right. I mean, obviously that's something that's a very important belief. And then I'm talking about the distinctive part here.
This universe has the uppermost thing in this universe is that energy cannot be created or destroyed. Energy is eternal. And this universe came from an isotropic quantum vacuum potential, from the quantum energy of the universe. That's how we got the universe. So all these things that you have mentioned.
The universe is a closed system unless God exists. Yeah. So in the universe, things wind down.
I don't believe that God exists because I have a better explanation that you haven't heard. And the whole physics department over Stanford knows this. Let me try that once again. You will agree that energy cannot be created or destroyed.
Yeah.
You know that. I mean, you should know that. So if energy cannot be created or destroyed, then energy always existed.
Yeah, but there's the second law of thermodynamics that it winds down, right?
That's that.
But I mean, this is the point being, of course, God can create more energy.
You and I are violations of the law of thermodynamics. Inanimate matter has entropy, and things get more disordered.
Yeah.
But we are systems of disorder. We take in energy from the order of the universe, and we store it. And so we are able to think about these things because we have enough energy to make things that are anti-entropic, that they order other things.
Yes, but only by producing more entropy
Yes, I
in our
figured
environment.
we produce more disorder.
Yeah.
But since we're all here and we're having this discussion, and you
No, so,
especially,
but, I mean, I think there's the preservation of energy, right? Certainly would be disrupted by God creating something new, right? The preservation of energy would be disrupted by God making something new, by God inserting something new.
if he created some new energy that wasn't here.
Yeah.
But he doesn't do that. He just rearranges the energy.
I mean, in a miracle, you could claim that that's one thing that may happen, right? If God interferes, there's something new entering to the system.
No, he just, the
I
system.
think the incarnation, right?
The
I mean,
system,
that's God himself entering the
he
system.
doesn't create any new energy. He rearranges the energy.
How do you know that?
Huh?
How do you know that?
Well, I could go a long time explaining it. Tell me why.
Yeah, you can. That would be a physical explanation, but God made these laws of our physics, and He could
No.
also make exceptions.
I'm just giving you an explanation from the
You guys-
laws of physics.
can you guys
that I
talk later?
understand pretty well.
Yeah.
We continue that later. There are other questions. Let's have another question.
I was just curious if there is sort of like, given that the Vatican, right, is presumably like evaluating these cases, do they have like, I don't want to say like a list, but like a place where like you could go to sort of like look into these things for yourself? Like I don't know. A list sounds kind of like plain, but like a list of miracles or a database of miracles to sort of look into.
Well, I don't think the Vatican has a database for miracles, but there's of course. I mean, one source that I just recently found is on the Shroud of Turin, and this is it's a critical summary of, let's say, the observations, data, and hypotheses. So it's done by the scientists that themselves have studied that, and it's basically looking at the history of the question also, and going through all of that and accumulating the data on that. So that's a good resource on that particular one, but you have to look at particular items, and the Vatican is not going to give that to you. If you want to research in Lourdes, I'm pretty sure that would be possible. I mean, you could go into the files that they have on these cases.
So I guess I'm sort of asking, like, is there a way to sort of, is there like a jumping off point if I want to like learn more about them, or like, you know, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's a good question, because I've sometimes looked myself, and there's no one point to look at. You have to look at who is written on that. I mean, that's true for many scientific questions. I mean, that people publishing on things that you have to read their work. Some are specialists in that area, and others are not. And so, but that having been said, I mean, Father Robert Spitzer has a pretty good thing on his Asmarges website. I mean, that he has something on Our Lady of Guadalupe and also the Shroud of Turin. So that's Father Robert Spitzer, Jesuit. And this is the Asmarges website, MAGAS.
One more question and then we'll call it a night. Who's got one? Oh, there we go.
When I think about miracles described in the Bible or performed by saints and the like, one observation one can make is that they don't cover the full range of diversity one could imagine, right? You can imagine you can imagine a comic book version of Jesus who, rather than overturning the tables of the money changers in temple, like shoots lasers out of his eyes or something, right? So, I mean, in many cases, you could say they appear to be, as you were saying a couple minutes ago, be consistent with natural processes like healing, or sometimes instantaneous. But in terms of that, if you kind of look at the perhaps more limited diversity of miracles as we, the church believes that they've existed, versus, say, things that are similar in mythologies of other religions, like Zeus turning into a bull. No apostle ever turned into a bull to trample the Romans or anything like that. Do you or the church have anything to say about that?
That's another further important question. I mean, miracles are not just brute acts of force. They tend to have a significance. And I think the vast majority of miracles are probably healing miracles. And that says something about God. It's careful. And there are apocryphal stories about Jesus as a boy, making little birds out of clay, clapping his hands, and the birds fly away. Or here's, the omnipotent child God, playing around with these kind of things. But that's not in Scripture. And Aquinas, for example, discounts that precisely for the reason that as a child he wouldn't be yet in a position to teach. And for Aquinas, the miracles are coupled with the teaching of Jesus, which at the same time make explicit the significance of what is happening. And again, I think that is specific also for Christianity. And you can compare religions a lot. I mean, so David Hume makes this whole other case about, there are miracle claims in other religions, don't they cancel each other out and so forth? No, they don't. I mean, you have to look at exactly what happens, And there could be demonic miracles, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's from God and so forth. And if you are, it's gone now, if you have this pantheist where everything is one big blob, well, within that big blob, you may have minor deities doing mayhem, but you couldn't have this transcendent God doing the kind of miracles that Jesus is doing, for example. So you have to evaluate that. But with that background, it is interesting to look at what miracles Jesus works and what he doesn't. And so maybe one more thing on the healing part. Could there be genuine miracles in other religions? I think there could be. Imagine you are God. There you are, yes, the universe, and there's a pious Muslim woman praying there for her sick child, for Allah to heal her. Well, what would you do? Die, infidel. No, I think God would do that, could do that, and that wouldn't be evidence against Christianity or even for Islam in that case. It would be just evidence for that God that we both believe in. So, and in fact, there are cases like that. So, have you heard of the Lebanese hermit Charbel Makhlouf? It's a saint, Saint Charbel Makhlouf. And he lived as a hermit in the Lebanon, and very holy man in the 19th century. And it's a pilgrimage place, and all the typically crutches hanging there and so forth. But a good part of them is done for Muslims. Right? So that's possible. And I think that's true ecumenism.
So, Father, did you talk about all these things in this book you're writing?
The book I'm writing is on art. That's a totally different But I have some writings on that question too, if you're interested.
I want that now.
Well, thank you, everybody. We'll stick around for a little bit, but thank you so much for coming. Get out.
So maybe I didn't necessarily question.
Hi.
Not before the